The autumn of 1886 in the high plains of eastern Colorado was not a season of gentle decline, but a stark and hurried retreat. The sun, which had beaten down with white-hot fury all summer, now hung low and pale in a sky the color of washed-out linen, offering little more than a memory of warmth. The wind, a constant resident of that vast, treeless expanse, changed its voice from a dry summer whisper to a low, mournful howl that scoured the land, stripping the last brittle leaves from the cottonwoods huddled along the shallow creek, and sending dust devils dancing across the endless stretches of cured brown grass. For the small, isolated settlement of Prairie Ridge, this was the season of preparation. A frantic race against the inevitable arrival of a winter that did not merely visit, but conquered, burying the world under a crushing weight of snow and cold that could last for months. It was a time for salting meat, stacking firewood, and mending the seams of houses that would soon become fortresses against the siege of the northern gales. It was in this atmosphere of urgent communal industry that the activities of Elara Vance became a source of quiet consternation. A widow for 2 years, left with a small son and a quarter section of land that was more rock and wind than soil, Elara was already a figure of some pity. But now, her actions seemed to border on the peculiar. While other townsfolk were securing their homes and livestock, Elara was seen making daily trips with her rickety wagon to the site of the old, collapsed silver mine, a few miles south of the settlement. She was not gathering firewood or hunting, but laboriously collecting the detritus of that failed enterprise. Rusted sheets of corrugated iron, twisted lengths of angle iron, and heavy, discarded boilerplates. She worked alone, her movements methodical and unhurried, her slight frame silhouetted against the enormous sky as she loaded the scrap metal piece by heavy piece and hauled it back to the cavernous barn that stood beside her small, lonely house. Her purpose was not immediately clear, and this mystery fueled the low murmur of gossip that passed between homesteads. Dora Kelleher, whose husband Amos was the closest thing Prairie Ridge had to a leader, was certain Elara intended to sell the scrap in Denver. A fool's errand, she declared over her washtub. As the journey was long, the price of scrap was low, and the time would be better spent banking her house with sod against the coming freeze. Others speculated she was losing her senses, that the grief for her husband Thomas had finally curdled her mind. The collection of ugly, rusted metal seemed a pointless obsession, a strange and melancholy hobby for a woman who had more pressing concerns. The mystery deepened when it became clear she was not stockpiling the material to be sold. Instead, she began to build something. Not an addition to her house, nor a new shed for her milk cow, but a structure rising from the hard-packed dirt floor in the most sheltered corner of her enormous, drafty barn. It was Amos Kelleher who finally felt compelled to intervene, approaching her one afternoon as she wrestled a heavy timber into place for the frame of her strange construction. He was a practical man, a man who understood the unforgiving arithmetic of survival on the plains. And what he saw in Elara's barn made no sense. He stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of paternal concern mixed with profound bewilderment. The half-finished structure was a box, roughly 10 feet square, framed with salvaged lumber and now being methodically sheathed in the rusted corrugated iron she had spent weeks collecting. It was a room within a room, a metal shed being built inside a wooden one. "Elara," he began, his voice softened with the tone one used for the grieving or the confused. "What is all this? Your house needs chinking, and there's a loose shutter on the west window. Winter's not waiting for you to finish your projects." He gestured at the metal box, its raw, ugly form a jarring presence in the familiar, hay-scented dimness of the barn. His skepticism was not unkind, but it was absolute, rooted in a lifetime of received wisdom. A shelter was a house. A house was made of thick sod or milled lumber, and it stood on its own foundation under the sky. This thing she was building defied all known principles of sound construction. It was an anomaly, a folly. Elara paused in her work, wiping a smudge of rust from her cheek with the back of her hand. She looked at Amos, her eyes clear and steady, showing no sign of the madness the town was beginning to attribute to her. "I know winter is coming, Mr. Kelleher," she said, her voice even. "This is for the winter." His brow furrowed. "This? A tin box? It will be colder in here than it is outside. Metal draws the cold, you know that. You and the boy will freeze solid in a single night." The community's collective doubt found its voice in his practical, logical objections. He saw thin sheets of iron and imagined the biting frost that would form on their interior face. He saw a small, enclosed space and imagined it becoming a tomb of frigid air. Dora Kelleher later reported to the other women that Amos had described it as a coffin of tin and dirt, and the phrase stuck, becoming the unofficial name for Elara's project. It was spoken with a shake of the head and a sigh of pity for the poor widow who was building her own useless, cold grave. Constance Hartwell was the exception. A woman of few words and even fewer judgments, she lived on the neighboring section. From her kitchen window, she could see Elara's barn and had watched the daily trips for scrap, followed by the slow, steady construction. While others gossiped, Constance observed. She saw not madness, but a deep and abiding purpose in Elara's labor. She saw the careful way Elara chose each piece of metal, the precision with which she cut the timbers. It was not the haphazard work of a troubled mind. It was the deliberate execution of a plan. Constance said nothing to the others, content to watch and wait, her curiosity a quiet counterpoint to the town's chorus of pitying dismissal. She understood that there were forms of knowledge that did not announce themselves loudly and were often mistaken for foolishness by those who had never encountered them. Elara was not deaf to the whispers, nor was she immune to the pitying glances she received on her rare trips to the general store. But her resolve was anchored in a place the others could not see, in the memory of her husband, Thomas. He had not been a farmer or a rancher. Thomas Vance had been an engineer, a man who had worked on the great steam locomotives that were now stitching the country together with rails of steel. He saw the world not as a collection of objects, but as a system of principles. He had been a quiet man, but when he spoke of his work, his explanations were models of clarity, revealing the invisible forces that governed their world. He had taught her to see beyond the surface of things, to understand the why that lay beneath the what. She remembered one winter evening, sitting by the fire in their small house, the wind shrieking outside. She had remarked that a bigger fire was needed to fight such a cold night. Thomas had shaken his head gently. "A bigger fire just burns more wood to heat the air that the wind is stealing from us," he had explained. "It's a losing battle. The trick isn't to fight the wind. The trick is to make the wind irrelevant." He had then picked up a small iron poker, heated one end in the fire until it glowed, and laid it on the stone hearth. "This poker is small," he said, "but it holds the heat. The stone beneath it will grow warm. The heat doesn't flee into the air. It soaks into the mass. A small, constant source of heat applied to a dense, insulated object is far more efficient than a great bonfire in a drafty room." That single lesson was the bedrock of her current project. The principle she was applying was one Thomas had called the double envelope. She tried, once, to explain it to Amos Kelleher during his visit. "The barn is the first envelope, Mr. Kelleher," she had said, pointing to the great weathered walls around them. "It's full of holes, I know, but its job isn't to be warm. Its job is to stop the wind. The wind is what carries the heat away. Inside the barn, the air will be still. It will be just as cold as the air outside, but it will be still." She then tapped the metal wall of her small interior room. "This is the second envelope. It only has to fight the still, cold air, not a 60-mile-an-hour gale. It's a much smaller battle." Amos had simply stared at her, his expression unchanged. "Cold is cold, Elara. Wind or no wind. A box is a box. You're wasting your strength on a theory." He could not make the conceptual leap. He, like the others, saw two separate things: a barn and a box. Elara saw a single, integrated system designed to manage the flow of thermal energy. Watching an outcome, Thomas used to say, was not the same as understanding the principle. They had all seen a fire warm a room, but they did not understand the mechanics of heat loss. Her labor was slow and arduous, a testament to her quiet determination. After erecting the timber frame, she began the meticulous process of cladding it. She fastened the sheets of corrugated iron to the outside of the frame, their overlapping ridges creating a surprisingly tight seal. Then, she began work on the inner wall. She built a second, lighter frame inside the first, leaving a gap of nearly a foot between the inner and outer skeletons. This was the most crucial part of the design. This cavity was the heart of her insulation system. She spent a week cutting thick, heavy bricks of sod from the banks of the creek, the rich, black earth bound together by a dense web of grass roots. She hauled them back to the barn and with painstaking effort began to pack the space between the two frames, fitting the sod bricks together as tightly as a stonemason would fit dressed granite. The sensory details of the work filled her days: the sharp, metallic screech of a screw being driven into old timber, the cold, unyielding feel of the iron sheets in the morning chill, the earthy, damp smell of the freshly cut sod, a scent of life and decay that clung to her clothes and hands. After the sod was packed to the ceiling, she spent another week hauling buckets of dry, loose dirt from a protected cut bank and pouring it into any remaining gaps, ensuring the cavity was completely filled. The walls of her small room were now a composite of wood, a foot of earth and sod, and an outer skin of iron. She built a door from 3 layers of salvaged planking, with an insulating layer of packed wool between them, and hinged it with heavy iron straps. For a stove, she used the firebox from a wrecked steam donkey she had found near the mine, a small but incredibly efficient cylinder of thick-rolled steel. She carefully ran the flue pipe through a tightly sealed hole in the ceiling of her room, then up through the high roof of the barn itself, a tiny metal chimney poking out of the vast expanse of weathered shingles. The first blizzard arrived in the second week of December. It did not come with dramatic warning, but with a quiet, insidious change in the quality of the light. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, began to soften, turning a milky, luminous white. The wind fell away to an unnerving calm, and the air grew so still and cold it felt thin in the lungs. Elara recognized the signs immediately. She led her milk cow into the most protected stall in the barn, ensuring she had ample hay and water. She carried the last of her firewood not into her house, but into the small, metal-skinned room inside the barn. Then, with her son Samuel, she sealed the door of their main house from the inside, and they made their way through the connecting passage she had built into the barn. They entered the small, earthen-walled room, and Elara sealed the thick, insulated door behind them, plunging them into a space of profound quiet and darkness, broken only by the dim light of a single lantern. Outside, the storm began its assault. The wind rose from a whisper to a roar in less than an hour, and the first flakes of snow, fine and hard as sand, began to hiss against the barn walls. Inside their small sanctuary, the sound was distant, a muffled, oceanic roar that seemed to belong to another world. The temperature inside the small room was the same as the barn outside, well below freezing. Elara calmly unpacked their supplies: blankets, food, water, and the small stack of seasoned piñon logs for the stove. She laid a fire with practiced care, using only a few small pieces of wood. She did not want a large, roaring fire. Thomas's words echoed in her memory, a small, constant source of heat. She lit the kindling, and the little stove began to tick and ping as the metal expanded. A faint, reddish glow became visible through the grate. Then came the waiting. This was the period where she had only faith in the principle to sustain her. There was no immediate, dramatic change. The air remained cold. A chill emanated from the packed earth walls. Samuel huddled under a blanket, his breath pluming in the lantern light. For hours, Elara simply tended the tiny fire, adding a single small log every hour. She was not heating the air in the room. She was heating the mass of the walls. She was slowly, patiently charging her thermal battery. Outside, the blizzard reached its full, terrifying fury. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the sheer weight of it made the massive timbers of the old barn groan and creak. But inside their refuge, the stillness was absolute. The roar of the storm was a low, continuous rumble, the soundtrack to their quiet isolation. It was a test of nerve, a test of her understanding against the raw, brute force of nature. By nightfall, the transformation began. It was not a sudden warmth, but a slow and subtle cessation of the cold. The biting chill in the air softened, losing its sharp edge. Elara placed her hand on the interior wooden wall. Hours ago, it had been frigid to the touch. Now, it felt merely cool, the deep, penetrating cold having retreated. The small stove continued to radiate its steady, modest heat, and now, instead of being instantly swallowed by the cold mass of the walls, that heat was beginning to accumulate in the room. The iron shell on the outside was battling the sub-zero stillness of the barn, but the foot of packed earth and sod was doing its work, a formidable barrier to the transfer of cold. The principle was holding. The system was working. She awoke near midnight to a profound silence. The tiny stove glowed with a dull, cherry-red warmth, its metal ticking softly. Samuel was sleeping peacefully beside her, his face relaxed, his breathing even. He was tucked under a single wool blanket, not shivering or huddled, but resting comfortably. This was the moment of truth, the sensory climax of her long endeavor. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the wall again. It was no longer cool. It was not warm either, but had reached a state of neutrality. It felt like living skin, radiating no cold, demanding no heat. The air in the room was fresh and still and carried a comfortable temperature that felt miraculous in its simple lack of hostility. Outside, the blizzard raged with undiminished violence, a symphony of chaos. But here, Inside her box of scrap and dirt, she had created a tiny island of equilibrium. In that quiet, stable warmth, she felt a wave of vindication so pure it was almost overwhelming. It was not a feeling of triumph over her neighbor's doubts, but a deeper, more personal connection to the correctness of an idea. She thought of Thomas, and of the simple, elegant principles he had lived by. The town saw her building a foolish box. She had been building a thermal battery. They saw scrap metal and mud. She had assembled a system for managing heat loss. They had trusted in the evidence of their eyes, which saw only thin metal, while she had placed her faith in the invisible laws of thermodynamics. Their knowledge was based on tradition and repetition, on what had always been done. Hers was based on understanding why it was done, and therefore, how it could be done better. The quiet, profound success of her shelter was a testament to him, and to the enduring power of a well-understood principle. The blizzard howled for 2 more days. Elara and Samuel lived calmly in their winter room, consuming little food and even less fuel. The small stove required only a handful of wood every few hours to maintain the stable temperature. They had created a pocket of survival that demanded almost nothing from them. On the morning of the 3rd day, as the wind began to show the first signs of abating, a new sound intruded upon their isolation. It was a frantic, desperate banging, not at the door of her distant house, but on the great, barred door of the barn itself. Elara unsealed her small room and made her way through the larger structure, the still, frigid air of the barn a shock after the comfort of her shelter. She slid back the heavy bolt and pulled the door open just enough to see who was there. It was Amos Kelleher, his face nearly unrecognizable, caked with ice and snow, his eyes wide with desperation. Behind him stood his wife Dora and their 2 children, all of them wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, shivering violently. "Elara," Amos croaked, his voice raw. "Our fire! We're out of wood! The house is freezing! We can't keep the hearth lit!" He was not asking for firewood. He knew no one could spare it. He was a man whose entire worldview, built on practical, traditional methods, had just been shattered by a force of nature his preparations were insufficient to withstand. He was asking for shelter. Without a word, Elara opened the door wide and ushered them in. The Kelleher family stumbled into the relative calm of the barn, momentarily stunned by the absence of the wind's direct assault. But their true astonishment came when Elara led them to the metal-skinned room in the corner. As she opened the thick, insulated door, a wave of simple, neutral air, not hot, but profoundly, blessedly not cold, washed over them. They stared into the small, lantern-lit space as if it were a mirage. They saw her young son sleeping peacefully under a single blanket. They saw the tiny stove, glowing faintly, with a small, neat stack of wood beside it that seemed impossibly large, for it was clearly a supply for days, not minutes. Amos stepped inside, his movements stiff with cold. He felt the air. He looked at his shivering wife and children, their faces blue with cold, and then at the calm, quiet warmth of this impossible room. He reached out and touched the packed earth wall, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning comprehension. He turned to Elara, his eyes finally meeting hers. The paternal concern and pity were gone, replaced by a raw, humbled respect. "I called it a coffin," he said, his voice hoarse and cracking with emotion. He swallowed hard, the admission costing him dearly. "It's an ark." Dora, who had spread the story of poor Elara's folly all over the settlement, simply began to weep, her tears of relief and shame freezing on her cheeks as she huddled her children into the life-saving warmth. Before the day was out, 2 other families had made the perilous journey to Elara's barn, their own homes having failed them. The Hartwells, whose house was better built, managed to hold out, but Constance watched the desperate pilgrimage to her neighbor's property and knew that Elara's strange project had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Elara took everyone in. Her small room became a crowded but vital sanctuary, the single point of warmth and life in a frozen, wind-scoured world. When the storm finally broke and the sun reappeared in a brilliantly clear sky, the people of Prairie Ridge emerged from their homes to a world transformed, and to a new understanding of the quiet widow in their midst. In the weeks that followed, the story of the winter room spread. The skepticism was gone, replaced by an eager curiosity. Amos Kelleher was the first to approach Elara, not with advice, but with a question. "Show me how," he asked, his tone that of a student, not a leader. "Explain it to me again." And so, she did. She explained the principle of the double envelope, of using the barn to defeat the wind. She described the insulating power of the packed earth and the crucial concept of thermal mass, how the walls themselves became the source of heat. She explained why a small, constant fire was better than a large, roaring one. They listened, and this time, they understood. They were no longer seeing just a box, but the elegant, life-saving system it represented. That next summer, a new industry took hold in Prairie Ridge. The sounds of hammering and sawing were heard from 6 barns as families began to build their own Vance boxes. They helped one another, hauling scrap and cutting sod, the communal effort now bent towards innovation instead of mockery. Elara moved freely among them, offering advice, pointing out how to seal a flue pipe properly, how to best pack the earth to avoid settling. She gave her knowledge freely, understanding that a principle, once proven, belonged to everyone who needed it. The winter rooms, as they came to be known, fundamentally changed life in the settlement. They became storm arcs, places of guaranteed safety that removed the deep, abiding terror of the winter blizzards. They reduced the need for firewood, freeing up time and labor for other vital tasks. The innovation, born of one woman's memory and methodical labor, had become the community's shared wisdom. Elara Vance's small room, built from the refuse of a failed mine, stood for 50 years, a quiet but enduring monument, not to iron and dirt, but to the profound, life-altering power of a principle correctly understood and courageously applied.